Cowboy fended off an eagle to save an Apache child. Next day, her mother asked to become his. The gunshot echoed across the canyon like thunder, but it wasn't aimed at any man. Thaddeus Kane lowered his smoking Colt, watching the golden eagle spiral away into the desert sky, its talons empty for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Below him, a small Apache child lay motionless on the rocky ledge, blood seeping from fresh wounds on his tiny shoulders. What happened next would change everything Thaddeus thought he knew about survival, honor, and the thin line between enemy and family. 3 days earlier, the morning sun had painted the New Mexico territory in shades of amber and rust. Thaddeus guided his horse through a landscape that seemed to breathe with ancient secrets. The year was 1874, and this corner of the world still belonged more to the Apache than to any map drawn by white men in distant offices. He was tracking stolen cattle, following hoofprints that led deeper into Apache territory than any sensible cowboy should venture. But Thaddeus had never been accused of being sensible. At 30 years old, he carried the weathered look of a man who had learned hard lessons under an unforgiving sun. His leather chaps bore the scars of thorns and rope burns, while his wide-brimmed hat shadowed eyes that missed nothing. The tracks led him through a maze of red sandstone formations, each one carved by wind and time into shapes that seemed almost deliberate. Ancient petroglyphs decorated the rock walls, telling stories in a language he couldn't read but somehow understood. This was sacred ground, and he was trespassing. His horse, a sturdy paint mare named Duchess, picked her way carefully along the narrow trail. She sensed the tension in the air, her ears constantly swiveling to catch sounds that might mean danger. Thaddeus trusted her instincts more than his own sometimes. The cattle tracks were joined by others now, unshod ponies moving with the purposeful gait of horses that knew this terrain intimately. Apache raiders, no doubt, driving the stolen herd toward some hidden canyon where they could butcher the animals and smoke the meat for winter. Thaddeus should have turned back. Every rational thought in his head screamed at him to retreat, to report the theft to the cavalry and let them handle it with their usual heavy-handed approach. But something kept him moving forward, a stubborn streak that had gotten him into trouble more times than he could count. The trail wound upward through a series of switchbacks that left Duchess breathing hard. They climbed toward a mesa that commanded a view of the surrounding country for miles. If the Apache were watching, they would see him coming long before he saw them. As they crested a ridge, Thaddeus caught sight of smoke rising from a hidden valley below. Not the thick black smoke of a grass fire, but the thin gray wisps that spoke of cooking fires and human habitation. He dismounted and led Duchess behind a boulder, then crawled forward on his belly to get a better look. The valley opened like a green jewel in the desert, fed by a spring that created a small oasis of cottonwoods and grass. Adobe structures hugged the valley floor, their earth-colored walls blending seamlessly with the landscape. This wasn't a temporary camp but a permanent settlement, hidden from the outside world by the natural fortress of the surrounding cliffs. Children played near the stream while women tended cooking fires and worked animal hides. Men sat in the shade, repairing weapons and crafting tools. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that contradicted everything Thaddeus had been told about savage Apache raiders. His stolen cattle grazed peacefully in a makeshift corral, but he barely noticed them now. His attention was drawn to a young woman kneeling beside the stream, washing clothes in the clear water. Even at this distance, he could see the grace in her movements, the way sunlight caught in her long black hair. She was perhaps 20 years old, with the kind of beauty that seemed to belong to this harsh landscape. Her doeskin dress was decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the light as she moved. There was something about her that made him forget why he had come here, forget the danger he was in, forget everything except the need to see her more clearly. A child's laughter drew his attention to a small boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old, who was playing near the edge of the valley. The boy had wandered away from the others, chasing a butterfly that led him toward the rocky slopes where the valley walls began their steep ascent. Thaddeus watched with growing unease as the child climbed higher, following the bright wings of his quarry. The adults below seemed unaware of how far the boy had strayed from safety. That was when he saw the eagle. It circled high above the valley, riding the thermals with effortless grace. Golden eagles were magnificent creatures, but they were also opportunistic predators. A small child, alone and vulnerable on an exposed ledge, would present an irresistible target. The eagle began its descent, folding its wings and diving toward the unsuspecting boy. Thaddeus was too far away to shout a warning that would be heard, too far to reach the child in time. He had perhaps seconds to act. Without thinking, he drew his Colt and aimed skyward. The shot was nearly impossible, firing uphill at a moving target while lying prone behind a boulder. But sometimes impossible shots were the only ones worth taking. The bullet missed the eagle by inches, but the sound was enough to break its dive. The great bird pulled up sharply, circling away from the child who now stood frozen on the narrow ledge, finally aware of his danger. But the eagle wasn't finished. It climbed again, preparing for another attack. This time it approached from a different angle, using the cliff face to mask its approach until the last possible moment. Thaddeus was already moving, scrambling down the rocky slope toward the valley floor. He could hear shouts from below as the Apache spotted him, but he ignored them. The only thing that mattered was reaching that child before the eagle did. He slid down a scree slope, sending loose rocks cascading ahead of him. His boots struggled for purchase on the unstable surface, but he kept moving, driven by an urgency he couldn't fully explain. The eagle struck just as Thaddeus reached the base of the cliff. Its talons raked across the boy's shoulders, drawing blood and eliciting a scream of pain and terror. The child stumbled, his foot slipping on the narrow ledge. Thaddeus fired again, this time from much closer range. The bullet passed so close to the eagle's head that he could see individual feathers scatter in the wind. The bird released its grip on the child and wheeled away, finally convinced that this particular prey was too much trouble. But now the boy was falling. Thaddeus dove forward, his arms outstretched. The child's small body struck his chest with enough force to drive the breath from his lungs. But his arms closed around the boy protectively. They hit the ground hard, Thaddeus taking the worst of the impact as they rolled together across the rocky earth. For a moment, everything was silent except for the child's frightened sobs. Then Thaddeus became aware of other sounds, closer sounds that made his blood run cold. Apache warriors surrounded him, their faces painted for war, weapons drawn and ready. He had saved their child, but he was still a white man in the heart of Apache territory. The fact that he was breathing meant nothing had been decided yet. The boy in his arms looked up at him with dark eyes wide with shock and pain. Blood seeped from the claw marks on his shoulders, but the wounds didn't appear to be life-threatening. Thaddeus gently set the child aside and slowly raised his hands, showing that he held no weapons. The warriors closed in, their faces grim. One of them, a man with graying hair and the weathered look of a veteran fighter, stepped forward. He wore the red headband of a war chief, and his eyes held the kind of hardness that came from years of fighting for survival. The chief spoke in rapid Apache, his tone questioning but not yet hostile. Thaddeus understood none of the words, but he could read the tension in the man's posture. This was a moment balanced on a knife's edge. Then the young woman from the stream appeared, pushing through the circle of warriors with the desperate urgency of a mother protecting her child. She dropped to her knees beside the injured boy, her hands gentle as she examined his wounds. Her name, Thaddeus would later learn, was Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in her language. But in that moment, she was simply a mother terrified for her child's safety, speaking soft words of comfort in Apache while tears streamed down her face. The war chief, who was revealed to be her father Nalnish, watched as she cleaned the boy's wounds with water from a leather pouch. The child, whose name was Kiva, meaning feather, had already stopped crying. more interested in staring at the strange white man who had appeared from nowhere to save him. Ayanna looked up at Thaddeus, her dark eyes meeting his for the first time. In that moment, something passed between them that neither could name. Gratitude, certainly, but something deeper as well. Recognition, perhaps, or the stirring of possibility in the space between two worlds. She spoke to her father in their native tongue, gesturing toward Thaddeus. The war chief's expression remained stern, but Thaddeus caught something in the man's eyes that might have been respect. More Apache emerged from their hidden dwellings, drawn by the commotion. Women and children gathered at a respectful distance, their faces curious but cautious. Men stood ready with weapons, waiting for their chief's decision. Nalnish stepped closer to Thaddeus, studying him with the intensity of a man who had learned to read character in faces and gestures. He spoke in heavily accented English, each word carefully chosen. "You saved boy. Why?" The question was simple, but Thaddeus sensed that his answer would determine whether he lived or died. He thought about lying, about claiming some strategic advantage, or hoping to curry favor. Instead, he told the truth, because he needed saving. The war chief's eyes narrowed, searching for deception. Finding none, he nodded slowly. In Apache culture, action spoke louder than words, and Thaddeus had proven himself through deed rather than speech. But respect didn't guarantee safety. These people had every reason to distrust white men, to see them as enemies who brought only death and broken promises. The fact that Thaddeus had saved one of their children might buy him his life, but it wouldn't erase generations of conflict and betrayal. Ayanna stood, her son cradled in her arms. She spoke again to her father, longer this time, with passionate gestures that left no doubt about her feelings. Thaddeus couldn't understand the words, but her meaning was clear. She was arguing for his safety, perhaps even his acceptance. The debate that followed was conducted in rapid Apache, with various members of the tribe offering their opinions. Some voices were clearly hostile, demanding that the white intruder be killed regardless of his recent actions. Others seemed more moderate, willing to consider the debt of gratitude owed for the child's rescue. Throughout it all, Thaddeus stood motionless, his hands still raised, knowing that his life hung in the balance of a discussion he couldn't understand. The sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat ran in rivulets beneath his shirt, but he didn't dare move or speak. Finally, Nalnish raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of absolute command. The hostile voices fell silent, though their owners didn't look pleased with whatever decision had been reached. The war chief turned back to Thaddeus, his expression unreadable. "You stay. Tonight, we talk more." It wasn't exactly freedom, but it wasn't death either. Thaddeus lowered his hand slowly, nodding his acceptance. Two young warriors stepped forward, clearly assigned as guards, but they didn't bind his hands or treat him roughly. Ayanna approached him, her son still in her arms. Kiva had stopped bleeding and seemed more curious than frightened now, reaching out to touch the silver concos on Thaddeus's vest. "Thank you," she said in careful English, her accent musical and soft. "Kiva is my heart. Without him, I would be nothing." Her words hit Thaddeus harder than any bullet. Looking into her eyes, seeing the depth of her gratitude and the strength of her love for her child, he understood that he had crossed more than just geographical boundaries today. He had stepped into a different world, one where family and honor meant more than gold or glory. As evening approached, the Apache settlement settled into its nightly routines. Cook fires were rekindled, and the smell of roasting meat filled the air. Children played games in the fading light while their parents prepared for another night in the endless struggle for survival. Thaddeus was given food and water, simple fare but prepared with care. The women who served him were polite but distant, their faces revealing nothing of their thoughts. He was an outsider, a representative of the people who had driven them from their ancestral lands and confined them to this hidden refuge. Yet he had saved one of their own, and that counted for something in a culture that valued deeds above words. As darkness fell, Nalnish approached with several other men, all of them warriors by their bearing and the weapons they carried. They seated themselves in a circle around a small fire, and Thaddeus was gestured to join them. The war chief studied him for a long moment before speaking. "My daughter says you are different. She says your spirit is good, that you acted without thought of reward or gain. Is this true?" Thaddeus considered his answer carefully. These men would know if he lied, would sense any deception in his words or manner. "I saw a child in danger. I did what any decent man would do." One of the other warriors snorted derisively, speaking rapid Apache that clearly questioned whether any white man could be considered decent. Nalnish silenced him with a look. "Many of your people have been here before. They come with promises of peace, then bring soldiers and chains. They say they want to help, then steal our children and force them into schools where they forget their people's ways. Why should we trust you?" The question was fair, and Thaddeus knew that his answer would determine not just his immediate fate, but possibly the course of his entire life. He looked across the fire at these proud men, seeing in their faces the accumulated weight of betrayal and loss. "You shouldn't," he said finally. "Trust has to be earned, and my people have given you every reason to doubt their word. All I can tell you is that I'm not here to steal your children or your land. I came looking for cattle, but I found something more valuable." "What is that?" Thaddeus met the war chief's eyes directly. "The knowledge that there are still places in this world where honor matters more than profit, where a man's worth is measured by his actions rather than the color of his skin." The words hung in the night air between them, honest and unadorned. Nalnish translated for the others, and Thaddeus watched their faces as they considered his statement. One of the younger warriors, a man whose scars spoke of recent battles, leaned forward aggressively. "Pretty words, white man. But words are wind. Your army speaks of peace while they build forts on our sacred places. Your government signs treaties with one hand while the other holds a knife behind their back. Why should your words mean more than theirs?" It was Ayanna who answered, appearing at the edge of the firelight with her son sleeping in her arms. She spoke in Apache, her voice carrying a conviction that needed no translation. Her father's expression softened as he looked at his daughter and grandson. When she finished speaking, he turned back to Thaddeus. "She says you faced death to save a child who means nothing to you, a child of people you have been taught to call enemy. She says this is not the action of a man whose heart is divided. She asks that we judge you by what you have done, not by what others of your race have done." The debate continued long into the night, with voices raised in passion and anger, in fear and hope. Thaddeus said little, understanding that this was not his discussion to dominate. These people were deciding not just his fate, but potentially opening a door that had been locked by years of violence and mistrust. Finally, as the fire burned low and the desert grew cold around them, Nalnish made his decision. "You will stay among us for 7 days. You will work alongside our men, eat at our fires, sleep under our protection. If, after 7 days, you prove yourself to be a man of honor, you will be free to leave. If you prove otherwise." He didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. 7 days. It wasn't much time to prove himself worthy of trust, but it was more than he had any right to expect. Thaddeus nodded his acceptance. "I understand. And my horse? She will be cared for as one of our own." As the council broke up and the men dispersed to their homes, Ayanna lingered by the dying fire. Kiva had awakened and was looking at Thaddeus with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "He asks if you are the Eagle Man," she translated, a small smile touching her lips. "He says you fought the Sky Hunter to protect him." Thaddeus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of carved bone, a horse he had whittled during long nights on the trail. He offered it to the boy, who accepted it with delight. "Tell him the eagle was just doing what eagles do. But sometimes we have to stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous." Ayanna translated, and Kiva clutched the carved horse to his chest, chattering excitedly in Apache. He says he will be brave like the Eagle Man, she said, her voice soft with emotion. He says when he grows up, he will protect children from sky hunters. Looking at this young mother and her son, seeing the hope in their eyes despite all the hardship they had endured, Thaddeus felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he wasn't just drifting from one job to the next, following cattle trails and collecting wages. He had found something worth fighting for, something that made the danger and uncertainty worthwhile. As they walked toward the small adobe dwelling where he would spend the night, Ayanna spoke quietly. My father is a good man, but he carries much pain. He has seen too many promises broken, too many friends killed by men who looked like you. Be patient with him. And you? Thaddeus asked. What do you see when you look at me? She paused at the doorway, her dark eyes searching his face in the moonlight. I see a man who risked everything to save my son. In my people's beliefs, that makes you family, whether you choose to accept it or not. The word family hung between them, heavy with implication and possibility. Thaddeus had been alone for so long that he had almost forgotten what it meant to belong somewhere, to be part of something larger than himself. Inside the dwelling, a simple but comfortable space with woven rugs and practical furnishings, he lay on a soft-hide bed and stared at the ceiling. Outside, night sounds filled the desert, the call of owls and the distant howl of coyotes. Tomorrow would begin his 7 days of trial, 7 days to prove himself worthy of trust and acceptance. But as he drifted toward sleep, he found himself hoping for something more. He hoped to prove himself worthy of the woman who had called him family and the child who had dubbed him the Eagle Man. 7 days to change the course of his life entirely. The first day dawned with the harsh beauty that defined this corner of New Mexico territory. Thaddeus woke to the sound of women grinding corn and men discussing the day's hunting plans in hushed tones. The adobe dwelling where he had slept was simple but expertly crafted, its thick walls keeping the interior cool despite the rising heat outside. Ayanna appeared at his doorway as he emerged, carrying a bowl of atol, a warm corn drink that tasted of earth and sustenance. She wore a different dress today, this one dyed in deep blues and decorated with shells that caught the morning light. My father wishes to see how a white cowboy works, she said, her English more confident in the daylight. You will help with the horses today. The Apache had a reputation as some of the finest horsemen in the world, and Thaddeus soon understood why. Their herd was small but magnificent, each animal carefully bred for endurance and intelligence. The horses moved with a fluid grace that spoke of perfect understanding between rider and mount. Nalnish introduced him to the horsemaster, an elderly man named Hastian, whose hands seemed to speak a language the animals understood instinctively. Despite his age, Hastian moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the subtle communications of horses. Show me how you work, Hastian said in broken English, gesturing toward a young stallion that had never carried a rider. Breaking horses was a skill Thaddeus had learned through necessity and pain. Countless hours spent understanding the minds of animals that valued their freedom above all else. But the Apache approach was different from anything he had seen before. Where white horse breakers relied on dominance and submission, these men sought partnership and mutual respect. Hastian demonstrated first, approaching the stallion with movements so slow and deliberate they seemed like a ritual dance. He spoke constantly in Apache, his voice maintaining the same calm rhythm whether the horse stood still or shied away. Gradually, through patience and respect rather than force, he gained the animal's trust. Your people break the spirit, Hastian explained, allowing Thaddeus to stroke the stallion's neck. We seek to join with it. A broken horse is a servant. A willing horse is a brother. The lesson resonated deeper than mere horse training. Thaddeus began to understand that everything in Apache culture was built on this foundation of mutual respect rather than domination. It was a worldview that challenged everything he had been taught about strength and leadership. As the day progressed, he worked alongside the Apache men, learning their methods and earning their grudging respect through competence rather than words. His hands were already calloused from years of ranch work, but the Apache techniques required different muscles, different approaches to problems he thought he had already mastered. The children of the settlement watched him with undisguised curiosity, following at a safe distance as he moved through his tasks. Kiva was among them, the carved horse clutched in his small fist, his wounded shoulders bandaged but not slowing him down. During the midday break when the heat made work impossible, Thaddeus found himself sitting in whatever shade he could find, sharing water and dried meat with men who had been enemies in his mind just days before. The conversation was limited by language barriers, but communication found other ways to bridge the gap. One of the younger warriors, introduced as Bidzi, which meant hawk, challenged him to a friendly contest of marksmanship. Apache warriors were known for their accuracy with both bow and rifle, and Thaddeus soon learned why. Bidzi could put 3 arrows into a target, the size of a silver dollar, from distances that would challenge most men with rifles. When Thaddeus demonstrated his own skills with the Colt, sending 6 bullets through a playing card at 20 paces, the Apache warriors nodded with professional appreciation. Skill was a language they all understood, regardless of the color of the hand that wielded it. "You shoot well for a white man," Bidzi said, but there was respect in his voice rather than mockery. "I've had plenty of practice," Thaddeus replied, reloading his weapon with practiced efficiency. "A man doesn't survive long out here without learning to hit what he aims at." As the afternoon wore on, he found himself working closer to where the women processed food and crafted tools. Their work was no less skilled than that of the men, requiring knowledge passed down through generations about which plants healed and which harmed, how to preserve meat for the lean months, how to create beauty from simple materials. Ayana was among them, her hands busy with intricate beadwork while she supervised Kiva and several other children playing nearby. Thaddeus caught himself glancing in her direction more often than he should, drawn by the grace of her movements and the sound of her laughter when the children did something amusing. Their eyes met across the working area, and she offered him a smile that seemed to acknowledge his attention without encouraging it. There was wisdom in her restraint, an understanding that whatever was growing between them needed time to develop properly. The second day brought different challenges. Nalnish assigned him to join a hunting party led by his son, a fierce young warrior named Chi, whose face bore the ritual scars of a proven fighter. Chi spoke no English and seemed to have little interest in communicating with the white intruder beyond what was absolutely necessary. The hunt took them into country that grew wilder and more remote with each mile. Ancient mesas rose like sleeping giants from the desert floor, their surfaces decorated with petroglyphs that told stories from before the coming of horses or metal tools. This was country that belonged to the Apache not just by right of possession, but by spiritual connection spanning countless generations. Chi led them to a waterhole hidden deep in a canyon where deer came to drink in the early morning hours. The approach required absolute silence and patience, qualities that Thaddeus had developed during his years as a tracker, but never to the degree demanded by Apache hunting methods. They waited for hours in positions that would have been uncomfortable for minutes, barely breathing as various animals approached the water. Rabbits came and went, followed by a small band of javelinas whose sharp hooves clicked against the rocks. Finally, just as the sun reached its highest point, a young buck appeared at the canyon rim. The shot, when it came, was taken by Chi with a bow rather than a rifle. The arrow flew with deadly accuracy, bringing down the deer cleanly and quietly. But what impressed Thaddeus most was what happened next. Before approaching their kill, Chi knelt and spoke to the animal in Apache, what sounded like words of apology and gratitude. He explained later, through gestures and broken English, that the deer had given its life to feed their people, and such sacrifice deserved recognition and respect. "All life is sacred," he said, his scarred face serious. "We take only what we need, and we honor what we take." It was another lesson in the Apache worldview, one that challenged the casual relationship with death that characterized much of frontier life. These people killed when they needed to, but never casually, never without acknowledging the cost. On the third day, Thaddeus was assigned to work with the women, a task that would have been considered beneath a man's dignity in white society, but which the Apache viewed as essential knowledge for any adult. He learned to identify edible plants, to process hide into leather, to weave baskets strong enough to carry water. The work brought him into closer contact with Ayanna, who served as his primary teacher for tasks that required detailed explanation. Her English continued to improve with practice, and he found himself picking up words and phrases in Apache as their communication became more natural and fluid. "Why do you live alone?" she asked during one of their conversations, her hands never pausing in their work as she spoke. "Among my people, a man without family is like a tree without roots. He may grow tall, but the first strong wind will knock him down." The question caught him off guard, forcing him to examine choices he had made without really thinking about their consequences. He had drifted from job to job, town to town, never staying anywhere long enough to form lasting connections or build something permanent. "I suppose I never found the right place to put down those roots," he said, watching her nimble fingers transform plant fibers into rope. "Or maybe I never thought I deserved to have them." She looked up at him then, her dark eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "A man who would risk his life to save a child he doesn't know deserves whatever happiness he can find. The question is whether he's brave enough to reach for it." Her words stayed with him as the days continued, each one bringing new challenges and unexpected revelations. He learned that the Apache were not the savage raiders described in newspaper accounts, but a people fighting desperately to preserve their way of life against overwhelming odds. They raided cattle and horses not from cruelty or greed, but from the simple necessity of feeding their children in a world that had grown increasingly hostile to their existence. By the fourth day, some of the warriors were beginning to treat him less like a prisoner and more like a visiting relative, whose place in the family had yet to be determined. They included him in conversations, asked his opinions on matters of hunting and tracking, and even shared jokes that required no translation to appreciate. But it was his growing relationship with Ayanna that represented the most significant change. What had begun as gratitude for saving her son was evolving into something deeper and more complex. They found excuses to work near each other, to share meals and conversations that stretched long into the evening hours. "Tell me about your world," she said one night as they sat beside the stream where he had first seen her. Kiva was asleep against her shoulder, exhausted from a day of play and learning. Thaddeus thought about how to describe a life that seemed increasingly empty when compared to what he had found here. Towns that existed only to extract wealth from the land. People who measured success solely by the accumulation of money and property. Relationships built on convenience rather than genuine connection. "It's a world where most people live like strangers, even when they're surrounded by others," he said finally. "Where a man can work beside someone for years and never really know who they are inside." She nodded as if she understood, though he doubted she could truly comprehend the isolation that characterized so much of white society. "My people believe that we are all connected, like the threads in a basket. Each thread seems separate, but they become strong only when woven together. When white men first came to our lands, we thought they would learn this truth. Instead, they tried to make us like threads that stand alone." Her analogy was more accurate than she probably realized. The white approach to life emphasized individual achievement over collective well-being, competition over cooperation, domination over harmony. It was a philosophy that had built cities and railroads and great fortunes, but at a cost that was becoming increasingly clear to him. On the fifth day, everything changed. A scout rode into the settlement at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with bad news. He spoke rapidly to Nalnish in Apache, gesturing toward the east and holding up fingers to indicate numbers that were clearly alarming. Within minutes, the peaceful morning routine of the settlement transformed into controlled urgency. Women began packing essential supplies while men checked weapons and prepared horses for what was obviously going to be a dangerous journey. Ayanna appeared at Thaddeus's side, her face pale with worry. "Soldiers," she said simply. "A full company, led by guides who know this country. They will be here by tomorrow, maybe sooner." The implications hit him like a physical blow. Someone had betrayed the location of this hidden sanctuary, and now the army was coming with overwhelming force to destroy it. The people who had shown him kindness and acceptance were about to pay a terrible price for trusting him. "They think I led them here," he said, not really asking because he could see the answer in her eyes. Some of the warriors were already looking at him with suspicion and anger, hands moving instinctively toward weapons. The trust he had spent 5 days building was crumbling in minutes, replaced by the bitter certainty that he was just another white betrayer in a long line of betrayers. "Did you?" Ayanna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question cut deeper than any blade. Looking into her eyes, seeing the hope warring with fear in her expression, he understood that his answer would determine not just his fate but potentially hers and Kiva's as well. "No," he said, meeting her gaze directly. "I swear to you on everything I hold sacred. I had no contact with anyone since I arrived here. But that doesn't matter now. What matters is getting your people to safety." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Whether she believed him or simply chose to trust him, he couldn't tell, but it was enough to keep him alive for the moment. Nalnish approached them, his face a mask of controlled fury. When he spoke, his English was clipped and precise, each word sharp with barely contained violence. "My scouts say the soldiers carry no flag of truce. They come for war, not talk. We must abandon our home again, find new hiding places in country that grows smaller each year." The pain in his voice was evident despite his attempt to remain stoic. This settlement represented years of work, a place where his people could live with some semblance of their traditional ways. Now it would be destroyed, scattered to the four winds by the relentless advance of what white men called civilization. "How much time do we have?" Thaddeus asked. "Until moonrise, perhaps a little longer if they make camp tonight instead of pushing through the darkness. Not much time to evacuate an entire community, especially one that included elderly people and small children. But the Apache were used to this kind of emergency, had been running from soldiers and Indian agents for decades. Their preparations were swift and efficient, guided by painful experience. As the day progressed, Thaddeus found himself caught between two worlds in the most literal sense. The Apache needed every capable fighter for the evacuation, but they couldn't fully trust him with knowledge of where they planned to go. At the same time, his skills as a tracker and marksman were too valuable to waste. The solution came from an unexpected source. Bidzi, the young warrior who had challenged him to the shooting contest, approached with a proposal that was either brilliant or insane. "You know how white soldiers think," he said in his limited English. "You could delay them, confuse their trail, buy us time to escape with the children and elders." It was a suicide mission, essentially. One man against an entire company of cavalry, armed with superior weapons and knowledge of the terrain. But it was also the only way Thaddeus could prove his loyalty beyond any doubt, the only way to demonstrate that his commitment to these people was stronger than the bonds of race or nationality. "I'll do it," he said without hesitation. Ayanna, who had been listening from nearby, stepped forward with an expression of fierce determination. "No," she said firmly. "If you go alone, you will die, and your death will not buy us enough time. But if someone who knows the secret paths guides you, someone who understands how to disappear in this country, ... She left the sentence unfinished, but her meaning was clear. "Absolutely not," Thaddeus replied immediately. "I won't put you in danger." "The danger is already here," she said, her voice gaining strength with conviction. "Whether I go with you or flee with my people, soldiers will be hunting me. At least this way, I can fight back instead of just running." The argument that followed was brief but intense, conducted in a mixture of English and Apache, with gestures filling in where words failed. In the end, it was Nalnish who made the decision, overruling both of them with the authority of a war chief who had learned to weigh impossible choices. "She knows trails that even our warriors have forgotten," he said gravely. "Paths her grandmother showed her when she was Kiva's age. Without that knowledge, you will be caught before dawn. With it, you might survive long enough to matter." It was settled with the brutal practicality that governed Apache survival. Sentiment and emotion were luxuries they couldn't afford when their children's lives hung in the balance. As evening approached and the evacuation entered its final phases, Thaddeus checked his weapons and equipment one last time. His Colt was cleaned and loaded, his rifle bore fresh ammunition, and his saddlebags carried enough supplies for several days in rough country. Ayana appeared beside him as he saddled Duchess, her own mount a compact Apache pony that looked built for endurance rather than speed. She had traded her decorated dress for practical riding clothes, and a rifle hung across her back alongside a traditional bow. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, still hoping she might change her mind. "I have been ready my whole life," she replied, her voice steady despite the enormity of what they were about to attempt. "The question is whether you are ready to trust an Apache woman with your life." Looking at her in the gathering darkness, seeing the strength in her posture and the determination in her eyes, Thaddeus realized that trust was no longer a question. Somewhere during the past 5 days, she had become the most important person in his world, and he would follow her into hell itself if that was what it took to keep her safe. "Lead the way," he said simply. As they rode out of the valley for what might be the last time, Thaddeus turned for one final look at the settlement that had changed his life so completely. Tomorrow it would be ashes and memories, another casualty in the endless war between two ways of life that seemed incapable of coexistence. But tonight, at least, its people would live to see another day. And if he and Ayana could buy them enough time to disappear into the vast wilderness that still belonged more to Apache spirits than American maps, that would have to be enough. The moon was rising as they disappeared into the labyrinth of canyons that stretched toward the eastern horizon. Two unlikely allies riding toward a confrontation that would test everything they had learned about courage, love, and the true meaning of sacrifice. The canyon walls rose around them like the ribs of some ancient beast, their red sandstone surfaces carved by millennia of wind and water into shapes that seemed to shift and breathe in the moonlight. Ayana led them through passages so narrow that their stirrups scraped against stone, along ledges where a single misstep would mean death on the rocks below. She moved with the confidence of someone following paths learned in childhood, paths that existed more in memory and instinct than in any physical markers visible to outsider eyes. Thaddeus followed close behind, trusting her completely despite the darkness and the treacherous terrain. They had been riding for 3 hours when she finally called a halt in a hidden alcove where ancient peoples had once sheltered from storms. Petroglyphs covered the walls, their meanings lost to time but their presence somehow comforting in the vast emptiness of the desert night. "The soldiers will reach the valley just before dawn," she said, dismounting and checking her pony's hooves for stones. "If we position ourselves correctly, we can watch their approach and choose our moment." Thaddeus studied the terrain below them, mentally mapping escape routes and defensive positions. The valley was visible in the distance, a dark smudge against the lighter stone of the surrounding mesas. Between them and the settlement lay a maze of arroyos and rock formations that could either provide cover or become death traps, depending on how events unfolded. "What exactly are we hoping to accomplish?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Confusion. Delay. Make them think they face a larger force than just 2 people. Buy enough time for our families to reach the sacred places where even Apache scouts cannot follow them. the sacred places. He had heard references to them during his time in the settlement, locations so holy that speaking of them to outsiders was forbidden. Mountains and canyons where the spirits of the ancestors dwelt, where the living could find sanctuary among the dead. And after that, assuming we survive the next few hours? Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, her face turned toward the stars that wheeled overhead with ancient constancy. "I do not know," she said finally. "My people will scatter like seeds on the wind, some to reunite later, others to disappear forever into the wilderness. The old ways are ending, whether we acknowledge it or not." The sadness in her voice cut through him like a blade. She was watching her entire world crumble, had probably been watching it happen her entire adult life. Yet here she was, risking everything to buy her people a few more days of freedom. "There might be another way," he said, an idea forming in his mind. "What if instead of fighting the soldiers, we led them away from your people entirely? Made them think the Apache had gone in a completely different direction?" Her eyes brightened with interest as she considered the possibility. "It would require sacrifice. Whoever leads them away might not return, but the rest would be safe. Your son would grow up free." She studied his face in the moonlight, seeing something there that made her reach out and touch his cheek with gentle fingers. "You would do this? Give up your old life completely to save people who were strangers to you a week ago?" The question forced him to examine his own motivations with uncomfortable honesty. When had these people stopped being strangers and become family? When had their survival become more important to him than his own? "They stopped being strangers the moment I held your son in my arms," he said. "The moment you called me family." The kiss that followed was soft and desperate, filled with all the words they couldn't say and all the futures they might never have. When it ended, they held each other in the darkness, two people balanced on the edge of eternity. "Whatever happens," she whispered against his chest, "know that you have given us something precious. Hope. The belief that not all white men are enemies. That understanding is possible between our peoples." Dawn came with the sound of horses and the rattle of equipment from the valley below. Captain Morrison led his company with the confidence of a man who had never failed to complete a mission, his weathered face set in lines of grim determination. Behind him rode 60 troopers, their uniforms dusty from hard travel, but their weapons clean and ready. The Apache guides rode at the front of the column, their faces carefully neutral as they led the soldiers toward the hidden settlement. These were men who had chosen survival over loyalty, who had accepted government payments in exchange for betraying their own people. Thaddeus felt a surge of disgust as he watched them, though he understood the desperation that drove such choices. From their concealed position, he and Ayanna watched the soldiers deploy around the valley with military precision. They had clearly done this before, surrounding entire communities and ensuring that no one escaped the net when it closed. "They expect to find families," Ayanna observed quietly. "Women and children, old people who cannot fight back. They are not prepared for what we are about to give them." The first shots came from opposite sides of the valley simultaneously, carefully aimed rifle fire that sent soldiers diving for cover and horses rearing in panic. Thaddeus and Ayanna had positioned themselves to create the illusion of a much larger defending force, using the echoes off the canyon walls to multiply the sound of their weapons. Captain Morrison shouted orders, trying to coordinate a response to an attack that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. His men fired back blindly, wasting ammunition on shadows and echoes while the real threat remained hidden among the rocks. For an hour they played a deadly game of cat and mouse, appearing just long enough to take carefully aimed shots before disappearing again into terrain that offered 1,000 hiding places. The soldiers grew increasingly frustrated, their disciplined formation beginning to fray as they chased ghosts through the labyrinth of stone. Then disaster struck with the randomness that characterized all warfare. A ricochet caught Ayanna in the shoulder as she moved between positions, spinning her around and sending her rifle clattering among the rocks. The wound wasn't life-threatening, but blood loss would weaken her quickly in the desert heat. Thaddeus reached her position just as the soldiers began a coordinated assault on the ridge where she had been firing from. There was no time for careful medical attention, only a quick bandage to slow the bleeding before they were forced to retreat deeper into the canyons. "Leave me," she gasped as he helped her onto her pony. "Take my horse and lead them away from here. I will slow them down as long as I can." "Not a chance," he replied, swinging into his own saddle. "We started this together, we finish it together." What followed was a running battle through country that grew increasingly wild and remote with each mile. The soldiers pursued them with dogged determination, following a trail that Thaddeus and Ayanna deliberately made easy to track. Behind them, the sound of pursuit never faltered, a constant reminder that capture meant death for both of them. They rode through landscapes that seemed carved from dreams and nightmares, past formations that resembled ruined cities and sleeping giants. The horses began to tire. Their breathing labored in the thin air of the high desert, but still they pushed on, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death. As the sun reached its zenith, they finally gained some distance on their pursuers by taking a route through a slot canyon so narrow that horses had to be led single file. The soldiers would have to dismount and follow on foot, buying precious time for escape. In a hidden grotto where a spring provided water and shade, they finally stopped to tend Ayanna's wound properly. The bullet had passed through the flesh of her shoulder without hitting bone, but she had lost significant blood and was growing weak. "How much farther to the sacred places?" Thaddeus asked as he cleaned and rebandaged the wound. 2 days, maybe 3. But the soldiers will catch us long before then if we cannot find a way to lose them completely. He studied the terrain around them, noting the way the canyons branched and twisted in all directions. Somewhere in this maze was the key to their survival if he could only see it clearly. The answer came with the rumble of distant thunder, though the sky above remained clear. Flash floods were the desert's most deadly surprise, walls of water that could appear without warning and sweep away everything in their path. "Upstream," he said, pointing toward the sound. "There's a storm in the mountains. If we can time this right... double quotes understanding dawned in her eyes as she grasped his plan. It was insanely dangerous, requiring them to stay ahead of both the floodwater and the pursuing soldiers while navigating terrain. That would be treacherous even under ideal conditions. It could work, she agreed, but we would have to abandon the horses. No animal could keep its footing in the flood. They prepared quickly, taking only essential supplies and weapons. The horses were turned loose to find their own way to safety, faithful animals who had carried them this far but could go no farther. The sound of approaching water grew louder as they climbed toward higher ground, following paths that Ayanna remembered from childhood explorations. Behind them, the soldiers entered the canyon just as the first surge of muddy water appeared around a distant bend. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a nightmare. The flood hit the cavalry column like a brown fist, sweeping away horses and men in a chaos of screaming and churning water. Some soldiers managed to reach high ground, but their equipment was scattered and their organization shattered. From their position on the canyon rim, Thaddeus and Ayanna watched the destruction with mixed emotions. These men had come to destroy everything she held dear, but they were still human beings, fathers and sons who would never return home. "War makes killers of us all," she said quietly, her voice heavy with sorrow. "Even when we fight for the right reasons." The flood passed as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a scoured canyon littered with debris and the scattered remnants of military equipment. Of Captain Morrison and his company, perhaps half had survived, and they would be in no condition to continue pursuit for days or weeks. As they made their way toward the sacred mountains where Ayanna's people had found sanctuary, Thaddeus found himself thinking about the future with a clarity that had been missing from his life for years. The old world he had known was gone, destroyed as surely as the Apache settlement in the valley below. but from its ashes, something new was being born. 3 months later, in a hidden valley high in the sacred mountains, Ayanna stood before her father wearing a dress of white doeskin decorated with turquoise and silver. Beside her, Thaddeus wore clothing that marked him as an adopted member of the tribe, a white man who had proven his loyalty beyond any doubt. The wedding ceremony blended Apache traditions with improvisations born of necessity, words spoken in 2 languages but understood by all who heard them. Kiva stood between them during the ritual, symbolically accepting Thaddeus as his new father and completing a family that had been born from the ashes of conflict. Do you take this woman as your wife, knowing that you also take her people as your people, their struggles as your struggles? Nalnish asked in formal English. I do, Thaddeus replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was accepting. Do you take this man as your husband, knowing that he gives up his place in the white world to stand with us in ours? The war chief asked his daughter. I do, Ayanna said, her eyes never leaving Thaddeus's face. As they kissed to seal their union, eagles circled overhead, riding the thermals that rose from the sacred peaks. But these were different eagles, their cries speaking of protection rather than threat, of new beginnings rather than endings. In the months that followed, other refugees found their way to the hidden valley, Apache families who had heard whispers of a place where the old ways were still honored. They came in small groups, traveling by night and hiding by day, guided by hope and the ancient knowledge that some things were worth any sacrifice to preserve. Thaddeus found his place among them not as a white man trying to become Apache, but as something new entirely, a bridge between worlds that had been at war for too long. His children would grow up speaking both languages, understanding both cultures, carrying the best of each into an uncertain future. The eagle that had started it all was never seen again, but its shadow lived on in the stories told around evening fires. The tale of the white cowboy who risked everything to save an Apache child, and the Apache woman who taught him that true strength came not from conquest, but from connection. And in the high country where eagles soared between earth and sky, 2 peoples who had been enemies learned to become family, one rescued child and one transformed heart at a time. Years later, when historians tried to make sense of the Apache wars and the closing of the frontier, they would focus on battles and treaties, on generals and politicians and the grand sweep of manifest destiny. But the real story, the one that mattered most, was written in the faces of children who learned that blood and race mattered less than courage and love. The eagle's shadow had fallen across them all, marking them as chosen for something greater than the sum of their fears and differences. In saving one child, Thaddeus had saved himself. In accepting one white man, the Apache had opened a door to possibilities that neither people had imagined. And high in the sacred mountains, where the spirits of the ancestors watched over their descendants, the sound of children's laughter echoed off ancient stone, a promise that some things could never be conquered, never be destroyed, never be forgotten. The Eagle Man had found his place at last.